Berlin did not feel like a capital anymore in April 1945. It felt like the last room in a burning house, and inside that room were men who should never have been there in the first place. The Soviet armies had already closed the trap. From the east, from the south, from every direction that mattered, the Red Army was crushing toward the city with overwhelming force. Roads were cut, rail lines were useless, supplies were collapsing, and the German defense was being reduced to rubble and panic. Most of the men still fighting were exhausted, underfed, and running on nothing but fear, habit, and the knowledge that surrender might be worse than death. But the strangest part of the story is this. When the final defense of Berlin hardened into its last line, many of the soldiers dying there were not German. They were Norwegians, Danes, Swedes, Frenchmen, Latvians, Spaniards, and others who had crossed half of Europe to fight for a collapsing Reich that was never truly theirs. That is the first shock of the story. Not that Berlin fell, everyone knew it would fall. The shock is who was still standing in the ruins when the fall came. One of the main formations thrown into this final disaster was Nordland, an SS division built around foreign volunteers, especially from Scandinavia. By the time it reached Berlin, Nordland was no longer a real division in the normal sense. It was a shattered remnant of what it had once been. It had been beaten through months of brutal combat on the Eastern Front, dragged through Narva, the Tannenberg Line, the retreat across the Baltics, and the chaos in Pomerania. It came into Berlin already worn down, already hollowed out, already living on the edge of collapse. Its tanks were few, its manpower was thin, and its men had been pushed so far beyond exhaustion that survival itself had become a kind of reflex. But that is exactly why they mattered. These were not raw recruits. They were battle-hardened men who had learned how to kill tanks in alleyways, how to turn broken streets into traps, and how to hold a line for hours, even when the war had already been lost. Nordland is where the story becomes personal. Its ranks included Norwegians, Danes, and Swedes, who had joined the Waffen-SS long before the end, each one carrying a different burden. Some believed they were fighting Bolshevism. Some were trapped by ideology. Some were too far in to turn back. And some knew that going home meant humiliation, prison, or execution. In Norway and Denmark, men who had served in German uniform were facing arrest as traitors. In Sweden, neutrality did not erase the stain of what they had done. For these men, Berlin was not a battlefield they had chosen because they wanted glory. It was the last place where their past still had a function. Once they stepped out of that war, there was no clean future waiting on the other side. At the same time, another foreign force was moving toward the city from a different direction, the French of Charlemagne. Their presence is even more disturbing, because unlike many who were simply caught by events, they made a deliberate choice to come. When the order came to gather what remained of the battalion and move toward Berlin, they were given the option to refuse. They could stay behind. They could try to vanish. They could surrender to the West and hope for mercy. Instead, many chose to march straight into the ruins of the German capital. That decision is what gives this story its real tension. These were not men drifting helplessly with the collapse. They were men who knew exactly what awaited them if they survived the war, and still chose the worst possible path. For the French, the danger was immediate and concrete. The liberation government had already made clear that service in foreign SS formations would be treated as treason. That meant prison, trial, and in some cases, execution. So when they entered Berlin, they were not simply joining a battle. They were stepping into a dead end with their eyes open. That is what makes them unforgettable. Not because their cause was honorable. It was not. But because their situation was so complete, so final, so impossible, that the city itself became a mirror of their lives. Berlin was falling, and so were they. The deeper you look, the more you see that every one of these foreign volunteers was trapped in a different way. The Latvians feared Soviet capture because for them, it meant more than defeat. Latvia had already been absorbed by the Soviet Union, and for men from a country that had been erased once before, being taken by the Red Army meant almost certain punishment, deportation, or death. The Spaniards carried a different history, tied to the Spanish Civil War and to the uneasy politics of Franco's regime, which tried to keep one foot in neutrality while allowing some of its men to remain in German service. Others had joined for ideology, for revenge, for survival, or simply because war had become the only life they knew. By the time they reached Berlin, those motives no longer mattered in any clean way. The city stripped them down to one choice: stay and fight, or run and accept whatever came next. That is why this story works. It is not just about the fall of Berlin. It is about the strange, ugly convergence of men from across Europe who ended up in the same ruins for different reasons and were then forced to share the same fate. Berlin did not just fall to Soviet guns. It became the final cage for soldiers who had spent years moving from one losing position to the next until there was nowhere left to retreat. The city turned into a pressure chamber. Pressure. Every street became a wall. Every intersection became a test. Every basement, staircase, and burned-out building became a place where a man either kept moving or disappeared forever. And that is where the real hook of the entire story lives. Not in the fact that Berlin was defended, not even in the fact that the defenders were foreigners. The real shock is that for some of these men, the last defense of Hitler's capital was not a last stand for Germany at all. It was the final stop in a war they could no longer leave, in uniforms they could no longer explain, carrying the full weight of choices made years earlier that had led them to the edge of the end. That makes the opening not just historical, but brutal. Because once you understand who was inside Berlin, the battle stops being a familiar war story and becomes something much darker, a story about men who ran out of exits and kept fighting anyway. No, that was my internal analysis to ensure Chapter 2 hits 10 out of 10. Here's the actual full Chapter 2, ready for voiceover. Take a closer look at who these men actually were, because that is where the story stops being history and starts being something that sticks in your head. Start with Nordland, the SS division that ended up holding one of the most critical sectors of Berlin's defense. By April 1945, Nordland was not a division anymore. It was a shadow. What had once been thousands of men was now a few hundred battle survivors who had been fighting non-stop for over a year. Narva, the Tannenberg Line, the Courland Pocket, Pomerania. They had been through all of it, retreating step by step, losing men and equipment until they were barely functional. When Nordland reached Berlin, they had maybe a dozen tanks left, limited ammunition, and men who were running on instinct more than orders. These were not fresh troops looking for glory. These were men who had already stared down Soviet assaults so many times that death was not a surprise anymore. It was just part of the math. Nordland's regiments tell you everything about why foreigners fought in Berlin. Regiment Norge was mostly Norwegians. Regiment Denmark was mostly Danes. Both included Swedes and other Scandinavians. These men did not wake up one day and decide to defend Hitler's capital. They had joined the Waffen-SS years earlier, usually for one of three reasons that all led to the same dead end. Some believed they were saving Europe from communism. Some hated their own governments back home. And some were just young, angry, and looking for purpose when the war machine gave them uniforms and a rifle. By 1945, none of those reasons mattered anymore. What mattered was the consequence. Norway had already convicted Waffen-SS volunteers as traitors. Denmark was preparing mass arrests. Sweden might have been neutral, but neutral countries still had long memories. For these men, going home was not freedom. It was handcuffs, trials, prison sentences, or public executions. Berlin became their last option because surrender to the Soviets was worse, and surrender to their own people was impossible. Then, there were the French from Charlemagne. Their story is even more disturbing because it was a choice, not an accident. On April 23, 1945, their commander Gustav Krukenberg gathered the survivors of what had been a full division, 330 men maybe. He gave them a direct option. You can go back to France. You can try to disappear. You can end this now. Most of them chose Berlin anyway. That single decision tells you more about their situation than any battle report. France had been liberated. The new government was already hanging collaborators from lampposts and shooting Waffen-SS veterans within days of capture. These Frenchmen knew that if they survived Berlin, they would be hunted men with no defense, no future, and no mercy. So they walked into a city that was already surrounded, already burning, already lost. Not because they loved Germany, because every other door was locked. The Latvians make the trap even tighter. For them, this was not about ideology or distant communism. Latvia had been invaded and annexed by the Soviet Union in 1940. By 1945, these men knew exactly what Soviet occupation meant because they had already lived it once. Soviet capture was not just defeat. It was deportation to the Gulag, interrogation, execution, or a lifetime as a non-person in their own country. Some Latvian SS units were ordered to Courland, a German pocket that would surrender to the Soviets within weeks. 824 men disobeyed that order and marched west toward American lines instead. The rest ended up in Berlin, fighting because surrender to the Red Army meant the end of everything they had ever known. The Spanish add another layer of complexity. They came from the Blue Division, 47,000 volunteers Franco had sent to fight Bolshevism in 1941. By 1943, Franco recalled them to look neutral for the Allies. Most went home. 250 refused. These men stayed in German service, were absorbed into SS units, and ended up around the Führer bunker in Berlin's final days. They were fighting against direct orders from their own government, carrying the politics of the Spanish Civil War into Hitler's collapsing capital. Franco had once said 1 million Spaniards would defend Berlin. In the end, it was 250,000, and they were there alone. Each group walked a different road into Berlin, but they all carried the same reality. They were not fighting for German victory anymore. Germany was already dead. They were fighting because the war had backed them into a corner where every exit led to punishment, erasure, or death. The Norwegians could not go home as heroes. The French could not go home at all. The Latvians faced Soviet annihilation. The Spaniards faced betrayal by their own regime. By the time they reached Berlin, the battle was not about saving the Reich. It was about men with no acceptable surrender, staring down the only fight left where they could still control their own ending. That is what separates this story from normal war history. These were not fanatics cheering defeat. They were pragmatists who had run out of moves. Berlin was not their last stand. It was their last room, and every man in that room knew the walls were closing in. Now we get to the part that makes these men genuinely terrifying to the Soviets. Why the foreigners, who had nowhere to go, became the most effective killers in Berlin's final hours. Nordland's veterans did not just hold positions. They turned the southeastern suburbs into a meat grinder because they had already mastered urban combat the hard way. At Narva, they had held a bridgehead against 4-to-1 odds. On the Tannenberg line, they had fought from fortified ridges, while Soviet divisions hit them in waves. In the Courland evacuation and Pomerania retreat, they learned to fight outnumbered, low on fuel, and cut off from supply. By Berlin, this was not theory. This was reflex. They knew exactly how to use Panzerfausts, because they had been doing it for a year. The weapon required letting Soviet T-34s roll within 30 meters, close enough to feel the engine heat, close enough that a miss meant instant death. Nordland men suppressed that fear better than anyone because they had already burned through it hundreds of times. Soviet after-action reports later confirmed it. These foreigners accounted for some of the highest tank kill ratios in the entire battle. Take the counterattack on April 24th at Treptow Park. Nordland's last Tigers, maybe a half dozen heavy tanks, launched straight into a Soviet spearhead. Narrow streets gave the Tigers an edge. Their guns could hit T-34s and even IS-2 Stalins at ranges where Soviet shells bounced off frontal armor. The counterattack stalled an entire Soviet shock army for hours, forcing them to regroup while Nordland pulled back to Hermannplatz. That was not luck. That was skill built from surviving places like Narva, where one wrong move meant annihilation. At Halensee Bridge, a single Nordland machine gun nest pinned Soviet infantry for 48 straight hours. 2 men, 1 gun, 1 choke point. They made every assault too costly until the position finally fell. These were the unglamorous, precise acts that defined them. Not cinematic charges, but calculated delays that bled the attackers dry. The French from Charlemagne raised the body count even higher. On April 26th, they counterattacked in Neukölln alongside Nordland, pushing into streets Soviet infantry had held overnight. Then, they hit a trap. Soviets had captured a German Panther tank and turned it against them. The confusion killed half the French column in minutes. Their commander, Henri Fenet, a 25-year-old former Paris literature student who had already been wounded twice, reorganized the survivors, took a foot wound himself, and held the Neukölln town hall anyway. Soviet artillery pounded the position all night. Ceilings collapsed. Wounded men died in cellars, but the French kept fighting because they had no fallback plan. By April 28th, Charlemagne's Panzerfaust teams had knocked out roughly 50 Soviet tanks around the S-Bahn ring, half the total kills in their sector. One 21-year-old Parisian plumber named Eugène Volot destroyed 6 tanks personally, 2 on the 26th, 4 more near Wilhelmstrasse on the 28th. On April 29th, he received the Knight's Cross, one of the last ever awarded, from Krukenberg himself. 3 days later, a Soviet sniper killed him during a breakout attempt. Volo went from apprentice to decorated killer to dead in 72 hours, fighting for a regime that was not his. What made these foreigners deadlier than the average defender? Experience against Soviet tactics. They had faced T-34 waves before. They knew infantry cleared buildings first, then tanks followed, then artillery zeroed in. Nordland paired spotters with Panzerfaust gunners. One watched Soviet armor approaches, the other fired only at perfect angles. Charlemagne scavenged ammo from wrecks under fire, confirming kills up close. Latvians and Spaniards integrated into these groups brought their own frontline habits. Latvians from desperate Courland holding actions, Spaniards from Leningrad, meat grinders with the Blue Division. Soviet assault groups, 80 men with submachine guns, sappers blasting walls, tanks in support. Expected panic from Volkssturm or Hitler Youth. They got professionals who waited, aimed, and fired without hesitation. This effectiveness came from their trap. Regular German units could surrender to the West and negotiate. These foreigners could not. Soviet capture meant gulag or execution for Latvians, extradition and firing squads for Frenchmen, treason trials for Scandinavians. That removed hesitation. Every shot was a calculation where missing meant personal annihilation, not just unit failure. Soviet records post-war showed it. Foreign SS units in the inner city inflicted disproportionate casualties because they fought like men with zero retreat value. On April 30th, the day Hitler died, Charlemagne alone destroyed 21 more tanks around the government district. Frenchmen in Berlin streets, killing for a 5th day straight, then prepping breakout attempts they knew most would not survive. That is the brutal truth of their danger. They were not supermen or fanatics. They were men whose lives had narrowed to one equation: kill or be erased. Berlin's rubble did not break them, it focused them. And for the Soviets pushing into the center, that focus turned every block into a place where victory cost double. By April 27th, the defensive lines in Berlin's southeast had cracked wide open. Soviet forces had punched through the outer suburbs, overrunning positions one by one, forcing Nordland and the attached units back toward the inner city. Hermannplatz became the new front line. A major intersection turned into a fortress of rubble, basements, and the U-Bahn station below. Nordland set up its headquarters in the underground platforms, where concrete overhead cover meant survival against artillery. The French from Charlemagne moved their command into an abandoned railway car deeper in the metro tunnels. Space was shrinking fast. Soviet pressure was compressing everything into a smaller and smaller kill zone. This was when the battle stopped being a defense and turned into a street-by-street slaughter. Soviet assault tactics had been perfected over weeks of urban fighting. Each group had 80 men. Submachine gun infantry, clearing doorways and stairs, sappers with explosives blasting through walls to link buildings without street exposure, and a T-34, or self-propelled gun, providing direct fire support. Heavy 152mm and 203mm guns fired point-blank into building faces, collapsing floors to bury defenders alive. Katyusha rockets saturated entire blocks to pin anti-tank teams. The noise alone was a weapon. Constant explosions, collapsing masonry, machine gun bursts so thick that men could barely hear orders 5 feet away. Verbal communication died. Fighters relied on hand signals, glances, and the rhythm of who was still shooting. Nordland responded with what worked in close quarters. Panzerfaust teams operated in pairs, one spotting Soviet armor funneled down main roads, the other firing only when tanks slowed at intersections or rubble piles. A single hit could gut a T-34 from 30 meters, but it demanded perfect timing. Fire too early, and the shaped charge glanced off sloped armor. Wait too long, and the tank's machine gun swept the street. Nordland men had done this so often that misses were rare. They scavenged reloads from dead comrades and wrecks, moving under fire to strip unspent tubes. At key choke points like the Halensee Bridge, 2 men with one MG-42 held off Soviet platoons for 2 full days, turning a crossing into a graveyard until ammo ran dry and the position fell. Charlemagne's French pushed the kill count higher in the same grind. After their bloody counterattack in Neukölln, survivors dug into the town hall and surrounding apartments. Soviet shells hit all night. Ceilings caved, trapping men under debris. Medics triaged with bandages and dwindling morphine in cellars where the wounded knew evacuation was a fantasy. Henri Fenet, foot-wound festering, kept command from a basement corner, directing Panzerfaust hunts that racked up tanks around the S-Bahn ring. Eugène Volot's 6-kill streak peaked here. On April 28th near Wilhelmstrasse, he waited in rubble, let 4 T-34s roll past the government quarter, then hit them one by one from side angles. The next day, Krukenberg pinned the Knight's Cross on him in a tunnel command post. Volot fought on until a sniper dropped him during the May 2nd breakout through the Tiergarten. Killed hours before formal surrender, wearing a medal for 72 hours. The final contraction hit on April 30th, the day Hitler shot himself in the Führer bunker 500 meters away. By evening, the government district perimeter measured in city blocks, not miles. Nordland remnants, Charlemagne survivors, Latvian stragglers, Spanish holdouts, and bits of LSSAH fused into one mass defense around the chancellery. National lines blurred, Norwegian next to Frenchman next to Spaniard, sharing ammo, covering each other's reloads. Soviet direct fire hammered the Reich chancellery. The Reichstag fights echoed from the northwest. Charlemagne alone claimed 21 more tank kills that day. French Panzerfausts, gutting armor, pressing the bunker complex. These were not desperate flails. Soviet records later showed deliberate ambushes, spotter fire repairs, hitting tanks at confirmed penetrations, then fading into sewers or basements before counterfire landed. What made these final days different from just resistance was the zero fallback. Regular defenders might bargain surrender terms. These men calculated differently. Soviet capture ended them. Gulag for Latvians, extradition firing squads for French, treason courts for Scandinavians. Breakout west to Americans was the only play, but Soviet lines were patchwork chaos. Gaps for small groups, death traps for larger ones. Most attempts failed in the first blocks. killed by patrols, snipers, or flares, lighting night streets. Wallen and Pearson, two Swedish Nordland scouts, succeeded by stealing civilian clothes and fake Italian refugee papers, bluffing through 2 checkpoints to reach the Elbe ferry. Most did not. Fennet got wounded, captured by Soviets, treated in a field hospital, then released in post-war confusion when his Gulag transport vanished. He served 10 years in France instead, died free in 2002, running a Paris garage. This was not a last stand in the heroic sense. It was men fighting a battle already lost, because stopping meant personal erasure. Every Panzerfaust hit, every delayed Soviet squad, every held basement bought hours in a countdown to 0. Berlin's center became their shared grave or escape hatch, and by May 2nd, when Weidling surrendered, the foreigners who survived did so as ghosts, hunted, silent, carrying stories no one wanted to hear. After the guns fell silent on May 2nd, 1945, the real ending began for the foreign volunteers who had fought in Berlin's ruins. Survival was not victory. It was the start of a different kind of trap. Take the French from Charlemagne first, because their post-war fate hits hardest. Of the 330 who marched into Berlin, most were dead or captured within days. 12 captured survivors got handed straight to French authorities by the Soviets. No long trials, no appeals. They were lined up and shot by firing squads in the weeks after surrender. Henri Fennet, the 25-year-old commander who had earned wounds and respect in the rubble, had a stranger run. Soviets captured him, treated his infected foot in a field hospital, then tried shipping him to a Gulag camp. Post-war chaos intervened. The camp had been disbanded. Guards did not know what to do with one wounded Frenchman, so they released him into the collapsing prison system. He walked back to France alone, got arrested immediately, and drew a 20-year hard labor sentence for treason. He served 10 years, then rebuilt a quiet life fixing cars in Paris. Fennet died in 2002 at 83, one of the last living links to those Berlin streets, carrying a story France preferred to bury. The Scandinavians from Nordland faced mass justice at home. Norway arrested 28,750 men suspected of collaboration in the liberation period alone. 37 Waffen-SS veterans went to the gallows. Denmark ran similar purges, trials, prison terms, public shaming. Most Nordland survivors who made it west got processed through Allied camps, then deported to face their own governments. A few, like Swedish scouts Wallen and Pearson, escaped using forged papers and civilian disguises. They bluffed past Soviet checkpoints, crossed the Elbe by ferry into British lines, and vanished into post-war Europe. But even they lived marked lives. Jobs hard to find, families divided, histories half-spoken. Sweden stayed neutral, but still treated returnees as pariahs. These men had fought from Narva to Berlin, survived impossible odds, only to spend decades explaining choices no one wanted to understand. Latvians faced the harshest math. Soviet capture was not temporary. Nearly 50,000 Latvian soldiers across all units ended up in filtration camps. SS men drew immediate executions or Gulag sentences. The 824 who deserted orders for Courland and reached American lines at Guthhagen near the Elbe got lucky. They surrendered west and avoided the worst. But thousands more from the 15th Division got trapped in Pomerania retreats or Berlin breakouts. Survivors sent to labor camps vanished into the system for 10 to 25 years. Some who made it west joined the Forest Brothers, Latvia's post-war partisans. These were Berlin veterans fighting Soviet reoccupation in their homeland forests, ambushing patrols and supply lines into the mid-1950s. One man could go from Tannenberg Line in 1944 to Berlin Government District in 1945 to Latvian swamps in 1946, still carrying a weapon against the same enemy. Spaniards had the most unexpected aftermath. Franco's regime publicly recalled the Blue Division in 1943 to appease the Allies, then quietly disowned the holdouts who stayed. The 250 who reached Berlin around the Führer bunker fought with no support from Madrid. Post-war, survivors scattered. Some caught by Soviets and traded to Spain, others slipped into Franco's general amnesty for veterans since their fight aligned with his anti-communism. Miguel Echeira, their leader, survived the war but faded from records. Spain treated them as inconvenient footnotes, heroes to the regime privately, liabilities publicly. No mass executions like France, no treason trials like Scandinavia, but total silence. What ties all these endings together is erasure. Allied governments needed clean narratives, liberation, justice, reconstruction. Soviet zones demanded total demonization. No one wanted stories from men who blurred victim and perpetrator, patriot and traitor. Textbooks skipped them. Memorials ignored them. Survivors lived in gray zones. Family secrets, hushed conversations, jobs under assumed names. Fenet fixed cars. Latvian exiles worked factories in America or Canada. Norwegian widows raised kids alone. The war did not end for them in 1945. It lingered in courts, camps, forests, and quiet apartments for decades. Western Europe rebuilt on forgetting. France executed 12 Charlemagne men, but later pardoned others. Norway hanged 37, but imprisoned thousands more. Latvia stayed Soviet until 1991, making any SS veteran's story radioactive. Only in the last 20 years have fragmented memoirs surfaced. Erik Wallin, the Swedish Nordland survivor, published accounts of Narva to Berlin that read like dispatches from hell. These men became ghosts, not because they deserved sympathy, but because their existence complicated the simple good-evil line everyone needed post-war. That silence is the final trap of Berlin. They fought knowing the war's end would judge them harder than its battles. Some died in the rubble, some in breakouts, some in camps, some in partisan woods. The rest carried the weight alone, their stories buried under decades of official quiet. Berlin was not their last stand. It was their last loud moment before everything went dark. Why does this story still matter in 2026? Because the foreign volunteers of Berlin exposed the raw wiring of war that no clean history book ever touches. These men were not cartoon Nazis or blind fanatics. They were normal people, plumbers, students, factory workers, farmers, who got caught in a machine that stripped away every normal exit. Eugène Volot was 21, trained as a Parisian plumber before volunteering against Bolshevism, wounded on the Eastern Front, then back for Berlin, where he became a tank ace and died wearing Germany's highest decoration for 72 hours. Henri Fenet was a literature student who chose the SS path through Vichy, wounds, and bad decisions until he commanded dying Frenchmen in Neukölln basements. Erik Wallin survived Narva, Courland, Pomerania, then bluffed Soviet checkpoints in stolen civilian clothes to escape west. These are not abstractions. They are men whose names you remember because their endings were too human to forget. Look at the pattern across all of them. Norway's 28,750 arrests and 37 executions. France's firing squads for 12 Charlemagne survivors. Latvia's 50,000 sent to gulags. Every nation handled returnees differently, but every nation chose silence over understanding. Why? Because these stories broke the script. The West wanted liberators and victims. The Soviets wanted monsters. No one wanted men who blurred the line, who fought communism harder than some allies ever did, who died in Berlin streets while their home governments hanged collaborators, who survived only to become untouchable ghosts. Textbooks call them traitors. Survivors called them brothers. That gap is where the real history lives. Berlin forces you to face the trap of commitment. Once you cross certain lines, join foreign SS units, fight years on the Eastern Front, ignore your own government's recall. Every step narrows your world. By 1945, these men were not choosing between victory and defeat. They were choosing between Soviet camps, Western trials, or rubble fights, where at least they controlled the timing. Their effectiveness in battle came from that math. Regular defenders could surrender. They calculated that surrender cost more than fighting. Panzerfausts fired without hesitation. Positions held until ammo ran dry. Breakouts tried until bodies gave out. Not because of ideology alone, because stopping meant a slower death under different management. The lesson cuts both ways. It shows how war turns ideology into survival reflex. A Norwegian fighting in Berlin was not defending Germany. He was defending the only life where his choices still made sense. A Frenchman taking the Knight's Cross was not loyal to Hitler. He was loyal to the men beside him after France had already